Throughout history, the criminal psyche has captivated and terrified us in equal measure. There are many faces behind the world's most notorious killers, faces we often associate with men, the violent monsters lurking in the shadows. But there is a side to evil that wears a different mask, one that hides behind the gentler, more inconspicuous appearance of women. The women in these stories are not the victims, but the perpetrators. Their stories are darker and more complex than most could ever imagine. Stories of pain, desperation, betrayal, and revenge. They are women who, for reasons rooted in their own twisted histories, chose violence as their answer. Whether driven by childhood trauma, greed, or the unforgiving need for control, these women stepped into the abyss and never looked back. They are not just women who killed, they are women who transformed, who became predators, hiding their monstrous inclinations behind sweet smiles and gentle words. Their tales are as horrifying as they are tragic, each one a reminder of the darkness that can lie hidden beneath the surface of even the most unassuming faces. In this series, we will uncover the stories of these female killers, how their twisted paths led them to murder, and how they eluded justice for so long. We will dive into their minds, the chilling actions they took, and the terrifying legacies they left behind. These are the stories of women who became monsters, and the terror they inflicted will stay with you long after you turn the page. The Blood Countess, Elizabeth Báthory's Reign of Terror. The snow lay thick across the land, a white veil that obscured the path leading up to the imposing and desolate castle nestled high in the Carpathian Mountains. The air was crisp and biting, the wind howling through the darkened trees. There, perched above the world, Countess Elizabeth Báthory's domain stood like a monument to darkness. The towering stone walls, thick with the weight of centuries of history, loomed like a fortress against the bleakness of the surrounding wilderness. Inside the cold, echoing halls of the castle, Elizabeth walked slowly, her footsteps muffled on the ancient stone floors. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows against the walls, adding an air of mystery and dread to the vast chambers. Her footsteps, deliberate and calculated, seemed to stir the air, making it feel as though the very castle was alive, watching, waiting. Elizabeth Báthory, a woman of rare beauty and noble birth, had once been revered for her grace and poise. A symbol of power and aristocracy, she had been born into wealth, her family tied to the royal bloodlines of Hungary. Her life seemed perfect, and yet it was a life rooted in darkness, where power was never enough, and the thrill of domination never fully quenched. Her outward charm masked a soul long corrupted, a mind twisted by cruelty and an insatiable hunger. For years the stories had spread, whispers that traveled like shadow across the countryside. Women who had vanished without a trace, servants who had been seen entering the castle and never returning. The whispers turned into murmurs of suspicion, until they became the accusations that would ignite a firestorm of fear across Europe. The Countess, they said, was no longer just a noblewoman. She was a killer, a sadist, who had found a dark, forbidden power in the blood of the young women she had lured to her castle. At first, the disappearances were thought to be simple accidents, or perhaps the work of bandits. But soon a more chilling pattern emerged. Young women, mostly peasants and poor girls from nearby villages, were brought to her castle, often under the guise of seeking employment or escaping the hardships of their lives. Some were orphans, others were promised work in the grand halls of her estate. But as they crossed the threshold into her domain, they stepped into a nightmare. Inside the castle, Elizabeth's servants and aides lived in a perpetual state of fear. They had seen the dark side of their mistress, the way she would lash out at the slightest provocation, the way her eyes gleamed with a cold, calculating light when she spoke of her interests. No one dared question her. She was a countess. She was untouchable. And yet deep in their hearts they knew that the women who entered the castle did not leave. They had heard the screams from the upper chambers, echoing down the stone hallways, but nothing ever came of it. No one ever dared speak up. In the secrecy of the night, Elizabeth's depravity unfolded. She had discovered the thrill of inflicting pain, of watching her victims squirm, their bodies twisted in agony. It started with the smallest cruelties, slapping them, making them kneel before her in terror. But as her appetite grew, so did her methods. Elizabeth had come to believe that by bathing in the blood of young virgins, she could preserve her youth and beauty. The rumors said that she was obsessed with this notion, that she believed the blood would keep her skin smooth and her face free of wrinkles. Whether this was true or whether it was just the madness of a deranged mind, no one could say for sure. But what was known was that the Countess grew bolder in her atrocities, her actions escalating into the grotesque. The torture chamber, hidden deep within the castle, became her sanctuary. There she would lock her victims away, slowly tormenting them until they were nothing more than shells of their former selves. They would be whipped, beaten, and sometimes starved, until Elizabeth finally grew tired of their suffering. Then came the bloodletting, the gruesome rituals where she would drain their life force. Some say she would bathe in their blood. Others claim she drank it from goblets, as if it were the finest wine. But one thing was clear: she was consumed by the belief that with each life taken, she could steal something vital. Something that would preserve her beauty, her power, and her dominion over the land. The bodies of the girls were hidden away, buried beneath the castle floor or disposed of in the nearby woods. No one ever found the bodies, not until years later, when the rumors began to take root and the fear surrounding the Countess grew too strong to ignore. Eventually, the whispers reached the ears of a local Lutheran minister, István Magyari. He had heard enough tales of strange happenings at the castle and of the many disappearances to become convinced that something terrible was happening. He began an investigation, quietly speaking to former servants and peasants who had once worked at the castle. The evidence began to mount, the accusations growing louder and more urgent. Eventually, the authorities were forced to act. In 1610, Elizabeth was arrested and taken into custody. The castle, which had once been a symbol of her power, now stood as a monument to her madness. During the trial, the full extent of her crimes was revealed. Accounts of torture, mutilation, and blood rituals poured in from witnesses, many of them former servants who had seen the horrors firsthand. They spoke of young women who had been trapped in the castle, forced into submission, and subjected to unimaginable torments. One woman testified that Elizabeth had killed over 600 victims. While some historians debate the accuracy of these numbers, it is clear that the Countess's reign of terror was far worse than anyone had imagined. Elizabeth herself was unrepentant. She never showed remorse, and she denied all charges, even as the evidence against her grew insurmountable. The trial revealed the grotesque scale of her crimes, but the punishment would not come swiftly. Due to her noble status, Elizabeth was not executed. Instead, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. Her once grand castle became her tomb. She was walled up in a set of rooms within the castle, her only company the cold stone walls and the shadows that danced like phantoms in the flickering candlelight. The fate of Elizabeth Báthory remains one of the most chilling stories in history. Her name has become synonymous with cruelty, and her legacy endures as a warning of the dangers of unchecked power and the darkness that can grow within the human soul. The once beautiful Countess, who had believed that she could capture eternal youth, was left to rot away in isolation, her beauty fading into nothingness. In the silence of her confinement, she was forced to reflect on the horror she had unleashed, the bloodshed that had defined her life. But even in her darkest moments, Elizabeth Báthory's name continued to haunt the land. The castle remained abandoned, its cold stone walls still holding secrets of the unspeakable acts committed within. And somewhere, in the distant echoes of the wind, her reign of terror still lingers, a reminder that true horror does not always come from the shadows, but from those who walk among us, hiding in plain sight. The Dark Widow, the ruthless tale of Velma Barfield. In the humid, oppressive heat of rural North Carolina, the stillness of the small town seemed to suffocate any chance of escape. It was a town with a past as murky as the swamps that lay on its outskirts. Swamps that hid not only the secrets of nature, but the much darker, far more sinister secrets of a woman named Velma Barfield. Her life seemed ordinary, even idyllic at first glance, but beneath the surface there was something rotting at the core, something cold and calculating. Velma's house was a small, modest home that stood on a stretch of land that seemed almost forgotten by time. The scent of old wood and dust filled the air. The front porch sagged slightly, giving off the illusion of weariness, as if even the house knew what horrors had transpired within its walls. Inside, the furniture was neat, everything in its place, but the odd smell that lingered in the air was difficult to place. It wasn't quite like food, it wasn't quite like decay, but something about it hinted at death. Velma herself was the picture of Southern charm. She was polite, sweet even, with the soft drawl of a woman who had spent her life in this town, surrounded by neighbors who trusted her. She had a reputation for being a doting mother, a reliable member of the church, and a woman with a wholesome, simple life. But all of that was an illusion. Behind her innocent facade lay a mind capable of chilling manipulation, a mind that could turn the very idea of care into something monstrous. It began quietly. Velma had been married twice before, and both of her husbands had passed away under suspicious circumstances. But nothing was ever proven. To the outside world, they had simply died of natural causes. Heart attacks, sudden illnesses, things that weren't questioned. But those who had lived in her small, tight-knit world began to whisper. Some even said they'd heard her speak with too much ease about death. She had never seemed to mourn. It was always the same calm demeanor, even when her husbands were buried 6 feet under. Her first husband, Thomas, died in the early 1960s. No one thought much of it at first. After all, people die of heart failure all the time, especially older men like Thomas. He had been a well-liked man, the kind who helped around the neighborhood and had friends who would remember him fondly. But when Velma remarried shortly after, some began to wonder. She had always been so eager to talk about her new love, the way she smiled at the mention of him. Then, in the early 1970s, her second husband, Dowell, passed away. The cause of death was once again attributed to heart failure, except this time something was off. Dowell was a man of relatively good health, and Velma's behavior during his passing was cold, calculated. She showed no signs of distress, no tears, only the same passive calm. It wasn't until Velma's third relationship that the truth started to slowly seep through the cracks in the facade. Her fiancé, Stuart Taylor, an older man who had a daughter, came to visit her at her home one evening. He had known Velma for years, and like many others, he believed in her innocence. But when he drank a glass of iced tea she had prepared for him, everything changed. He was dead within hours. The authorities, upon investigating, found no clear signs of foul play at first. Stuart had been healthy, had no known medical issues, and it seemed like another case of sudden, unexplained death. But this time, something about the situation raised suspicion. Stuart's daughter, shaken and suspicious, dug deeper. She learned that her father had been in perfect health before visiting Velma. He had even been looking forward to marrying her. Something didn't add up. The toxicology report would reveal a horrifying truth. Stuart Taylor had died from a lethal dose of arsenic. The investigation into Velma's past began to unravel the chilling web she had carefully crafted. Authorities began to dig into the deaths of her two previous husbands, and they quickly discovered a pattern. Each had died in a way that mirrored Stuart's death, albeit more subtly. The doses had been smaller, gradual, yet ultimately fatal. Velma had been poisoning them slowly, over months, even years, in order to avoid suspicion. The arsenic was ingested unknowingly, hidden in food, in tea, in her husband's favorite dishes, and when they died, she would mourn them, play the role of the widow with the utmost sincerity, her heartbroken face a mask she wore effortlessly. But it was her third victim, Stuart, that broke her perfect act. When the authorities arrived at her doorstep, they found Velma calm, almost as though she were expecting them. She didn't show any fear, didn't try to deny anything. There were no protests. The truth had been laid bare, and it was too late to cover it up. With a chilling smile, Velma simply remarked, "You'll never be able to prove it." The trial was a nightmare. What was once a small-town affair had become a media frenzy. The Black Widow, as she came to be known, had claimed 3 victims, and there were whispers of many more, all buried in the depths of her past. Investigators soon unearthed even darker details of her life. There were accusations of her involvement in the deaths of other family members, including her elderly mother. More poisoning, more slow deaths. The pattern was undeniable. Velma's charm had always worked in her favor. People were drawn to her warm smile, to the way she made everyone feel safe. She had lived among them for years, never suspecting that the sweet, quiet woman in the floral dress had been killing them slowly with poison all along. But once the truth came to light, the woman who had played the role of the innocent widow, the loving mother, the devoted girlfriend, became something far darker, a monster who had hidden in plain sight. Throughout her trial, she was unshaken, an eerie calmness settling over her like a second skin. The jury convicted her of murder, and Velma Barfield became the first woman in the U.S. to be executed by lethal injection in 1984. Her last meal consisted of a bag of chips and a can of soda. She didn't cry, didn't show any remorse. Her death was as cold as the life she had led. Velma's story would haunt those who learned of it for generations. She had come to symbolize the terrifying nature of a quiet, seemingly unassuming woman whose smile masked a dark and calculating predator. In the town she once called home, people would remember her not as a mother, not as a neighbor, but as the ruthless woman who had killed in the name of control, in the name of power. Her name was whispered among the townsfolk with a mixture of fear and disbelief, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who walk among us, hidden behind a smile. And in the deep corners of the southern swamps, where the land grows thick with secrets, Velma Barfield's legend lingers like the smell of decay, unsettling and eternal. The Black Widow, Dorothea Puente's death mansion. The sun hung low over the quiet streets of Sacramento, casting long shadows across the unassuming, faded house at 1426 F Street. It was a home like any other in the aging neighborhood, tucked away among rows of modest homes with neatly trimmed lawns. Yet within those walls, an insidious darkness festered, hidden beneath layers of calm and care. It was the kind of place where you could almost hear the ghosts of its past, if you listened closely enough. Dorothea Puente's house was a world of warmth on the surface. To anyone passing by, it looked like a house of safety, a home for the elderly, a place where they could find rest and comfort in their twilight years. Dorothea, a seemingly kind and well-spoken woman, had built a reputation in the neighborhood as a caring caretaker, an advocate for the elderly who had fallen on hard times. She ran a boarding house, offering shelter and food to those in need, and the neighbors praised her generosity. But there was something unsettling about the way she carried herself, a strange detachment in her eyes, a coldness that belied the sweet exterior she wore so effortlessly. Inside the house, Dorothea had created a perfect illusion. The walls were adorned with soft, floral wallpaper, the furniture was plush and welcoming, and the smell of warm meals always lingered in the air. But beyond the well-set dining table and the soft glow of the lamps, a quiet, almost eerie silence hung in the corners of the house, one that only grew more oppressive the longer you stayed. Beneath the surface of the kind words and comforting gestures, something insidious pulsed. It was a place where death was carefully orchestrated, a place where life could be snuffed out in an instant, hidden behind a veneer of compassion. Her victims came from all walks of life, vulnerable elderly people, many of whom were homeless or mentally ill, people who had nowhere else to turn. They came to Dorothea's house for care, for refuge. They had no family, no one to watch out for them, and they trusted her completely. She was their protector, their guardian in a world that had forgotten them. But Dorothea had other plans for them, plans that would end in their tragic deaths. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly. The first sign of something wrong came when one of her tenants, an elderly man named Pablo, suddenly disappeared. His family hadn't heard from him in weeks, and his room had been locked. Dorothea, of course, played the part of the concerned caretaker, assuring the authorities that Pablo had simply gone off to visit relatives. But as the weeks passed and the questions mounted, Dorothea's calm demeanor began to crack. There were whispers of missing people, people who had come to her house and then vanished without a trace. The true horror of Dorothea's reign of terror was only revealed when a social worker, a young man named John, became suspicious after noticing the same pattern of disappearances among her tenants. He had known many of the elderly residents personally, and something didn't add up. He decided to conduct a quiet investigation of his own, checking on Dorothea's house and the people who had gone missing under her care. What he found was beyond anything he could have ever imagined. The first discovery came when he decided to ask a few of the neighbors about the house and its residents. One neighbor, an elderly woman, had seen something disturbing, a faint smell coming from the backyard of Dorothea's property. She had initially dismissed it, thinking it was just the smell of old garbage or perhaps the remnants of a nearby animal carcass. But as the smell grew more pungent, her curiosity got the better of her. One evening she noticed Dorothea digging in the backyard, her shovel plunging deep into the earth, with a disturbingly rhythmic motion. The neighbor's stomach turned as she realized what she was witnessing, a woman burying something, or rather, someone. She called the authorities immediately. The police arrived at the house and began digging in the backyard. What they uncovered was nothing short of a nightmare. Beneath the soil, they found the bodies of at least 7 people, their remains buried in shallow graves. Some were wrapped in blankets, others in pieces of clothing, but all were the victims of a meticulously planned killing spree. Dorothea Puente had poisoned her victims with a slow-acting, undetectable drug, one that caused them to lose consciousness and eventually die in their sleep. The deaths appeared to be natural causes at first, but upon closer inspection, the truth became clear. Dorothea had been killing her tenants for months, even years, and hiding their bodies in the backyard as though they were nothing more than discarded trash. When the authorities dug deeper into her past, the full extent of Dorothea's cruelty came into focus. She had been convicted of multiple counts of theft and fraud in the past, using her charm to manipulate others and gain access to their resources. She had convinced several of her victims to sign over their Social Security checks, their pensions, and other valuables. But her greed had become insatiable, and she had taken it one step further. She had begun to kill for the money. Each of her victims was carefully chosen for their vulnerability. They were often elderly, physically frail, and mentally compromised. She would give them small doses of poison over time, making them weak and ill, until they finally succumbed to their deaths. And once they were gone, she would collect their life savings, using their funds to maintain her lifestyle. The investigation revealed that Dorothea had a long history of manipulating people, using her kindness and compassion as a mask for her true intentions. She had preyed on the elderly and the weak, those who trusted her completely, and had turned their lives into a nightmare. The authorities uncovered a trail of deception, lies, and murder that spanned years. She had been playing the role of the caring widow, the motherly figure who took in the lost and the lonely. But behind closed doors, she was a killer. Dorothea's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. People were horrified to learn that the kind woman who had run the boarding house was a cold-blooded murderer. She was convicted of 9 murders, though investigators believe there may have been many more victims whose bodies were never found. In the end, Dorothea Puente was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even behind bars, she remained unrepentant. Dorothea never showed any remorse for her actions. She had always maintained that she had been framed, that she was the victim of a terrible injustice. But the evidence was irrefutable, and her reign of terror had finally come to an end. To this day, the house at 1426 F Street remains empty, its once vibrant walls now weathered and worn. The neighborhood, once so full of life, now feels strangely hollow, as though the spirits of the victims still linger in the air, waiting for justice that can never come. Dorothea Puente's name is forever etched in the annals of criminal history as one of the most chilling examples of a black widow, a woman who used kindness and compassion as a weapon, a woman who took advantage of the most vulnerable among us to satisfy her insatiable greed and thirst for power. The Killing Smile, Aileen Wuornos, and the Road to Vengeance. The moon hung low over the Florida highway, casting pale light across the road as the engine of a rusted car hummed through the night. The heat of the day still clung to the asphalt, but the air had grown thick, humid with the promise of something darker on the horizon. Aileen Wuornos, a woman of sharp features and a haunted look in her eyes, drove through the night with a coldness that mirrored the emptiness of the road around her. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, but there was no escape from the storm brewing inside her. She wasn't running from the world, nor was she heading toward salvation. She was simply moving, a silent, unstoppable force, driven by a violent need to survive. But Aileen's road was not one of recovery or redemption. It was the road of vengeance, and it had no end. Aileen Wuornos had always been a woman on the fringes of society. Her childhood had been a nightmare, abandoned by her parents, abused by family members, and left to fend for herself on the cold streets of Michigan. She had been a victim from the start, discarded by the world before she even had a chance to understand it. By the time she was an adult, Aileen's heart had been hardened by the cruelty of the world, and the kindness she had once longed for had been replaced by an insatiable rage. But even as she grew older, as she became a woman with a face known to many in Florida, there remained something haunting about Aileen. Her haunted, wide eyes, her tense, jerky movements, everything about her screamed of a past that had broken her. It was no surprise when she found herself working as a prostitute on the side of highways, offering her body to men who were drawn to her rawness and desperation. They paid, and she let them. She'd learned to numb herself to the men who took advantage of her, who used her as little more than a vessel for their own desires. But inside, her anger simmered. Every encounter was a reminder of how the world had treated her, how it had chewed her up and spat her out without a second thought. And then came the turning point. It began with a man named Richard Mallory, a man who picked Aileen up one night in his car. He was a businessman, and at first he seemed harmless. But within moments of her entering his vehicle, something shifted. Aileen's instincts kicked in. She felt the shift in his demeanor, the change in the way he looked at her. There was something predatory about him, something that set off every alarm in her mind. He drove her to a secluded area, a place where there was no one around to hear her screams. But this time, Aileen wasn't going to be a passive participant. This time, she was ready. As Richard attempted to assault her, Aileen snapped. She reached for the gun she kept concealed, a weapon she had acquired for protection but had never truly used. Her hand shook as she pulled the trigger. The gunshot rang out, shattering the night, and Richard Mallory fell dead. It was not the first time she had fought back, but it was the first time she had won. After that night, something inside Aileen changed. She felt alive, but not in the way she had imagined. The act of violence had awakened something inside her, a twisted sense of justice, a craving for vengeance against the men who had abused her and countless other women like her. It was no longer about survival. It was about retribution. Aileen Wuornos became a predator, a woman who had been broken by the world, and now she would break it back piece by piece. As Aileen continued to drive the highways of Florida, picking up men who seemed like easy prey, her killings became more methodical. One by one, the men who took her for granted, who treated her like little more than a disposable object, disappeared. The bodies were often found in desolate locations, discarded like trash along the roadside. They had been shot, each of them killed in a manner that spoke not of mercy, but of rage, of a woman who had been pushed too far and was now taking what was hers. The media, of course, began to take notice. The press dubbed her the highway killer, or the damsel of death. But Aileen didn't care about the headlines. She cared only about the men she killed, the power she now wielded over those who had once controlled her. Each death was a statement, a violent shout to the world that she would never again be a victim. She was not a prey animal anymore. She had become the predator. But as the bodies piled up, the law began to close in on her. The breakthrough came when Aileen made a mistake. One of her last victims, a man named Tyria Moore, had been a companion to Aileen for a time. Tyria had been her lover, the only person who had seen Aileen's pain and rage up close. But when Aileen killed Tyria's latest lover, a man named Walter Gino Antonio, she made a critical error. She left behind evidence, an abandoned car, traces of her fingerprints. The authorities were soon hot on her trail. Aileen Wuornos was eventually captured after a nationwide manhunt. When she was arrested, she showed no signs of remorse. In fact, she was calm, eerily so, as if she had finally achieved the one thing that had eluded her for so long: justice. She had killed for herself, for the years of suffering she had endured, and she was ready to face the consequences. The trial that followed was as chilling as the murders themselves. Aileen's defense attorneys tried to argue that she had killed in self-defense, that she had been pushed too far by the men who had assaulted her. But the prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded killer, a woman who had taken lives out of pure vengeance and greed. In the end, the jury found her guilty of 7 murders, and Aileen Wuornos was sentenced to death. Her final moments were as twisted as her life had been. On the night before her execution, Aileen sat in her cell, writing a letter that would never be read. She wasn't crying, nor was she angry. She was simply waiting for the final step in a long journey that had started when she was a child. Aileen's face, so often twisted in rage and pain, softened as she spoke her last words. "I'd just like to say I'm sorry for what I did. I'm sorry for the pain that I caused. But in the end, I did what I had to do." On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. Her death was as violent as her life, but there was no justice in her final moments. Only a hollow end to a woman who had been shaped by a world that had abandoned her. Aileen Wuornos became a symbol of both the fragile human spirit and the destructive power of vengeance. She was a woman who had lived a life of abuse and rejection, who had been broken by the hands of men, only to become something much darker in the process. She was the embodiment of the fury that can rise in a person when they've been pushed to the edge, a figure both tragic and terrifying. Her story remains a haunting reminder of how violence can take root in the human heart, and how, when pushed too far, even the most vulnerable can become monsters in their own right.